Because what you don't know about energy can kill you. Here's Alex Epstein.
Welcome to Power Hour. I'm your host, Alex Epstein. I am joined as usual by my colleagues Don Watkins in Pennsylvania. Hey, Don.
Hello.
And Stefan Henna in Germany. Hey, Stefan.
Hey, everyone.
Okay, we've got a bunch of interesting stories today. And at some point, I might tell a story about a certain experience that I had that affected my thinking and energy, but we'll start with your stories. And then if I'm so inclined, I'll probably tell that story at some point. So Don, what's the first story you want to cover today?
Well, we talked a few weeks or possibly months now about the California electric utility PG&E and the responsibility that they had for the California wildfires, as well as the responsibility that bad policy in California had for the wildfires. But PG&E has announced that it has a new plan for avoiding wildfires, which is purposefully to black out as much as an eighth of California's population for as much as 5 days whenever there's dangerously high winds. And the impact of that is not theoretical. Like, they've actually had to cut power to communities in the past. And this happened a while back in Napa Valley in a town called Calistoga for 2 days. And you had a lot of problems with elderly residents, people who had medical devices that relied on electricity, grocers whose food would spoil, businesses that lost business. The Wall Street Journal had an article about this, and there was one small business owner who just from those 2 days lost $15,000. And according to PG&E, basically they're going to fix this problem, but it's going to take about 5 years or longer in order to not have to rely on blackouts. And I mean, if you really cared about human flourishing, your priority would be to make sure that people had access to safe, reliable power. But here you have a state of California, which in the midst of a situation in which citizens are being told that they could just lose power in order to protect against wildfires, they're instead focused on making energy more expensive and less reliable. In fact, another story that we probably won't get into this week, but in LA, the city is basically going to have their own Green New Deal that's going to be even more aggressive than California's already commitment to 100% CO2 free energy. So it's just, this strikes me as reflecting really bad priorities. And I am very happy that I no longer live in California.
Okay, well, I do live in California. So yeah, thinking about it, so what they say, 8% of Californians? Okay, so there are 40 million Californians. So that's
No, up to an eighth.
Up to an eighth, rather. Yeah. Sorry, I actually did that calculation properly. I just said 8% instead of an eighth. Right. So there are 40 million Californians. So an eighth is about 5 million, which is a significant portion of the United States. And yeah, just thinking about 5-day blackout, what that would mean. I mean, what that would mean to me personally, and what that means on any kind of significant scale. So this is the kind of thing that this actually scares me in a way that when people say, oh yeah, there might be storms or something like that, it's not nearly as scary. So, because this is really just completely castrating the human environment that we enjoy. So I'm going to think about how to somehow push back on this. And what do you have any sense of to what extent they're just focusing on preventing wildfires or even preventing their own appearance of responsibility at all costs? Because this is a truly drastic kind of measure.
No, I think that's a really good question. And part of what I haven't been able to find out yet is, like, I mean, because these are regulated utilities, right? Like, if this was any free market company, if Facebook said, hey, we're just going to shut down for our customers from time to time to solve some problems, they would probably face a lot of competition. But this is a very regulated industry. And so part of what I'm interested in is, what do the regulators think of this plan? And that I have not heard so far, because you could imagine that this is an attempt to, in effect, a threat to try to get regulators to allow PG&E to take a different approach, but that's not clear at all yet.
Got it. Stefan, what's your first story this week?
The Trump administration shelves the shelf, and what's meant by shelf is the outer continental shelf, which hosts a lot of oil and gas, of course. So in a previous Power episode, we talked about an Alaska court decision, which essentially stopped President Trump from opening up large parts of the outer continental shelf of the United States to oil and gas development, particularly in Alaska and the Northern Atlantic region. And as a result of that, now the Interior Department apparently has given up on giving out leases for these areas. And Secretary Bernard said that the decision is going through the courts, and this will take a while, and there's no point in now trying to give out leases because they might be subject to appeals. Environmental organizations were, of course, happy about this, and they demand that these drilling bans in the offshore areas should be off the table forever and should be protected areas where no development can ever happen. So right now, it doesn't look like it's an immediate problem because of the abundant onshore U.S. shale, of course. But I find it very troubling that just by the stroke of a pen by a president, essentially you can ban drilling activity in these vast areas, and this time in the offshore areas, but could also probably happen to onshore areas. And then there is no real efficient process to roll that ever back. You have to go through a lot of courts. You will face a lot of organizations with a lot of money in the courts that will make all kinds of arguments and delay tactics. And so the process is the ordeal. You can't really defend against that. And so essentially the entire ocean can be put off limits. You just need one president who is willing to do that with an executive order, and then it's very difficult to roll that back. And so one question I would ask is, this seems to be a one-way street, so can we see environmental obstructionists being sued in court over these billions and billions of dollars in resources that they blocked? But it appears that we never hear about that. This never happens. It's just a one-way street. One administration makes a decision, and then in the court cases, essentially environmental organizations are suing subsequent administrations that want to roll that back, but we never see it in the other direction. So it seems very one-sided and an uphill battle.
It's interesting to think about if you think about, okay, what are the benefits? What are the additional benefits of any given energy project, and how can those manifest themselves? Okay, so if we know in general that energy empowers people to basically empowers every human capability because it gives us this capability to use machines to do all kinds of work to improve our lives. So if we know that the more cheap and abundant and reliable we can make that, the more productive we can be in every area of life. And then we know that part of that productivity leads to unforeseen benefits, particularly life-saving. One example would be life-saving medical innovations or other kinds of innovations that are dramatically positive. It's interesting and sad to think about just how much progress has been stopped by people marginally opposing any given energy project. You can't see the destruction. It's an invisible kind of destruction, but it's very large. And it'd be interesting if somebody just, if whether the law is the right way to do this, but if people opposed environmental groups and said, look, I think that my parent died of cancer because you stopped progress in the country this much. I do think about that concretely, particularly if I know somebody who's died of cancer or somebody, I just think of times when friends of mine have been at risk, and I really do think about, God, if this person dies, I really am going to blame the green movement because they are holding back progress, and new ideas, new innovations are such a major consequence of energy abundance and the progress that that brings. One other thought I had in connection to this is how different, in a bad way, our attitude toward the ocean today is compared to our attitude toward the frontier in America. If you think about the frontier in America in the past, we had this general idea that if you can make a piece of land more productive and nobody's doing anything with it, then that that makes you entitled to own it. There's this idea of mixing your labor with something. And then we just think, oh, well, the ocean, we don't know how to do too much with that yet. But one thing is that we can get these ancient dead plants and get a lot of energy from them. And, we can put down these rigs. And then we've talked in past power hours of how like a lot of the different marine life forms like these rigs and hang out around them, and there's all kinds of cool stuff there. But just in general, yeah, this is taking a new area and creating value. And then of course when you're done creating value, then you can go do something else. And yeah, there can be issues like oil spills, although in the middle of the ocean, that's going to be a lot less of an issue than when you're right on the coast. And even those are quite rare, and even those are quite manageable when they happen. But we have all of this. The ocean is just the opposite of the American frontier. And one wonders, okay, what else could be happening in the ocean if we had an attitude of property rights and development versus an attitude of, government ownership of everything, basically ocean socialism plus anti-development philosophy. Don, what's your next story?
We're now seeing the first sort of detailed climate policy plan from a Democratic presidential hopeful, this one from Beto O'Rourke. And I'd love to summarize it for you, but you really can't summarize it. I mean, it's essentially a laundry list, and it's really interesting in that it's both incredibly detailed and really bizarrely vague in many places. And so, to the extent that there is a central idea, it's this commitment to guarantee net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 and to get halfway to that by 2030. And then there's just this really like thousands and thousands of words of a list of the various things he's going to do, many of them which are put in very vague terms. So, it kind of breaks down into making fossil fuels more expensive through regulation and maybe through taxing it. But he explicitly will not say whether he's for carbon tax or for cap and trade. But a lot of the proposals have to do with kind of vague attempts to make non-carbon energy cheaper. He says he's going to spend $200 billion on new R&D programs that will study technologies that will reduce carbon, and then basically just the government buying and paying for a lot of stuff from solar panels to electric car charging stations and various things to help mitigate bad weather. And it essentially in its approach is sort of what you could think of as the Green New Deal light. That is, it extends the timeline and it doesn't have an explicit commitment to just solar and wind or renewables. In fact, interestingly, he only mentions two forms of energy, which is fossil fuels, and then one mention of renewables in the whole thing, kind of like as a side issue. And so part of what is it in a certain way, it's more troubling to me than the Green New Deal, because it's the same grant of power and government control over the energy economy, but with much more of a lack of clarity about really how are you going to go about achieving this? Like, what restrictions are you going to put in place? What handouts are going to go in place? And it's worth mentioning that he does not at all mention nuclear in this whole laundry list of things that he's going to do in order to get us to carbon neutral by 2050.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see what the other candidates come out with. I mean, not interesting in a fun way, unfortunately. But so yeah, I'll use this occasion to tell a certain story, which has to do with I often get asked, yeah, some version of how did you become passionate about this issue of fossil fuels? And there's one particular development in my thinking that was very important to me, and I hope is important to other people, which was, and the summary of it was developing the idea of the risks of not using fossil fuels, like having a concept of the risks of not using fossil fuels. Of course, we all have a concept we're all given the concept of the risks of continuing to use fossil fuels, but there's not much thought about the risks of not continuing to use fossil fuels. And thus, you notice with all of the different proposals, people will just propose any hypothetical restriction on the continuing use of fossil fuels, and it's just considered an unmitigated positive. Like, oh well, of course, if we're going to mandate these EVs, which supposedly won't come from fossil fuels, or if we mandate solar, if we mandate wind, or if we outlaw fracking, all of these things are just all positive um, aspirations. And when before I started studying energy, I had a definite antipathy toward the green movement in general, because I knew that a foundational idea that they had is that we shouldn't impact nature. And I knew that impacting nature, transforming nature, that is our means of survival. So I had a very negative view of the green movement. But at the same time, with the issue of fossil fuels, I still had I did have an idea that, well, there's a big risk involved in using these with CO2 emissions, and I didn't have nearly as strong an idea in my mind of, oh, there's a risk of not continuing to use fossil fuels. So I was against the green movement, and so that made me very skeptical of anything they said, and suspecting that they were exaggerating the risks. But nevertheless, I didn't have this idea of, oh, there is a risk of not continuing to use fossil fuels. And what really changed my viewpoint was for a project that really had nothing to do with any interest in energy. I researched the life and career of John D. Rockefeller for an article that I wrote, and you can read it. It's called "Vindicating Capitalism: The True Story, the True History of this, or the Real History, I think, of the Standard Oil Company." But I was researching Rockefeller, and to understand whether Rockefeller was fundamentally a force for good or not, I had to because he had this alleged monopoly in the oil industry. I had to understand, well, what was the oil industry like before Rockefeller? So, because Rockefeller started emerging a lot in the late 1860s, early 1870s, and then was this very dominant player. And then that led me to study, well, how did we start using oil, which really started happening in the US in 1859. And when I started reading this history, two things struck me. And one of them may seem obvious and one of them may not, but I think both are not obvious and definitely not appreciated. And so the first one is the idea that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing. So cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing. And the way I really saw this was by reading accounts of what life was like when people didn't have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, particularly in the case of oil, when they didn't have illumination at night. And I would read stories of people in the countryside who didn't have illumination before oil, and I put myself in their position. I thought, wow, what that would just totally wreck my own desired way to live my life. Particularly, I love ideas. I want to study ideas, and I can't. That's going to be incredibly hard to do by candlelight, and that would. And there's all kinds of other things I enjoy at night, and just my life would be so limited. So not only would it be shorter in length, but just every day would be shorter. And that just struck. I never really thought of, wow, what would that be like? And then I realized, oh wait, that's life for a lot of people today. There are billions of people today who don't have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy for illumination or for anything else. And in The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, Chapter 2, I tell a story about a young woman in the Gambia where they definitely don't have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And she had a premature baby whom, if they had had cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, particularly in the form of electricity, they could have incubated, and the baby would have almost surely made it to survive. But because they didn't have that kind of energy, then they didn't have an incubator, even if they could afford one, there's no reason to. And so the baby died. And just think, wow, that's a whole life extinguished. And then that's a whole parent or potential parent whose life is just permanently changed in a negative way. And then that's just one example, but it's a powerful example of, okay, what happens when you have cheap, plentiful, reliable energy, or not. So that was this powerful point that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing. And then the other lesson I got from reading about Rockefeller was the idea that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is extremely difficult to produce. And I first got this idea when I was reading about um, what we used for illumination before oil, because I had thought of it as, oh, we had whale oil and then we ran out of whales, and then fortunately we had this other kind of oil. But actually there were many different competitors. There were different kinds of whale oil, there were different kinds of animal oil, different kinds of plant-based oils or alcohols, and they all worked in a certain sense. They could all in some sense provide light, but none of them could do it in a way that was truly cheap, plentiful, and reliable for a lot of people. And thus, you had all of these different technologies that worked, but they didn't matter very much because they couldn't work cheaply, plentifully, and reliably. And the core reason was because the industries producing them hadn't figured out what I would call a resource efficient process. They hadn't figured out a way of producing energy for very low, at a very low price, which means using very few resources. And if you can't figure out how to produce energy, a lot of it that's reliable using very few resources, then most people can't afford it, because most people, relatively speaking, don't have a lot of resources at any given time. So I realized, oh, what the oil industry did, it's not just that it figured out a way to produce energy, it's that it figured out a cheap, plentiful, reliable process, a resource efficient process for producing energy. And then that's what brought this fundamental benefit of energy to the world. So when I had these ideas that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing, then cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is extremely difficult to produce, that made me look at the present in a very different way. And when I realized, oh, wow, we still use a lot of oil, fossil fuels are 80+% of our energy, maybe there's a good reason for that. Maybe it's not a conspiracy. Maybe it's not just a historical accident. We didn't think of anything else or something. Maybe there's something about that form of energy and then the industry that produces it that's way better. That's way more resource efficient than the alternatives. And then if we weren't allowed to use that energy, then we would have all of these fundamental harms to human life, because we'd be deprived of the fundamental benefits of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy. And then when I started studying it, it was that started being confirmed, because I had heard, of course, well, some people would say in a very kind of cavalier way, oh yeah, well, yeah, of course we used to need fossil fuels and those were important, but now we know that A, they're causing a catastrophe, and then B, they're rapidly replaceable by alternatives, particularly renewables. But then that struck me as, okay, there's something off with this, because you're not acknowledging when you just say, oh yeah, we might have needed them in the past. Like, what kind of understatement is that? That's like saying we might have needed medicine in the past, or we might have needed antibiotics and vaccines in the past. Now, these are things that have extended life by decades and made the opportunity of our lives so much better. So it became a flag to me when different people, particularly experts in the field, would just slough off the role of fossil fuels in our lives to date as, oh, this is something that's just, yeah, maybe that was necessary in the past, but oh yeah, it was dirty too. And they would not only underestimate the past benefit, but then they would very much focus on the past negative. So that was one flag. And then I saw with these claims that, oh, well, it's causing an existential threat and it's rapidly replaceable. When I started studying the field and reading different thinkers and reading back in the literature, because I like to know how ideas evolve, I found that many of the same thought leaders who are today telling us that fossil fuels are causing imminent disaster and are rapidly replaceable by alternatives, particularly renewables, I realized, oh, wait, they've been saying that for 30 plus years. And yet, well, so then we have a track record that we can study. And then if we look in those 30 plus years, guess what happened? Well, we used a ton of fossil fuels. We kept using fossil fuels. They weren't rapidly replaced by alternatives because they still overwhelmingly have this resource efficiency advantage. They just have this achievement that's very, very hard to replicate. And that's why we keep buying fossil fuels, even if we say we don't like them. So that happened. And then that was supposed to make life worse. But then that should have made life worse because we had this imminent existential threat. But then life got better, and it got better in every respect. So life got longer, life got healthier. We're supposed to all get sick from pollution. And then even with respect to issues related to climate, we can quantify how dangerous or safe climate is for human beings. And then climate has gotten safer in the last 30 plus years. And then in fact, it's gotten safer in the last 100 plus years. And the whole dynamic here is the dynamic I mentioned at the beginning. Cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing, including to the livability of our climate. It's fundamental to everything because of a principle I've talked about before, which is that nature doesn't give us the environment we need to flourish. We need to transform it. And then energy is the amplifier of our transformative capabilities. So you can think of everything in life as nature doesn't give us good enough. It gives us way too many threats, not nearly enough resources. And what having cheap, plentiful, reliable energy does is allows us to transform every area of our life. It allows us to neutralize all kinds of different threats of every kind, and it allows us to create all kinds of resources of every kind. And so what the thought leaders who were supposed to guide us, by not recognizing that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing, by not recognizing that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is very difficult to create, um, and then also some other things in terms of them having an ideological bias toward believing that it's wrong for us to impact climate in every way. So they have basically a religious opposition to adding CO2 to the atmosphere, not quantifying how big a deal it is for human life, but just thinking that, well, we shouldn't be changing anything at all. And then also they have this religious obsession with renewables because they think of those as natural. So they have those biases as well. And so that the combination of what we can call ignorance and biases has led even really smart thought leaders to completely underestimate the past benefits of fossil fuels, overestimate the past risks, and then make horrific recommendations. In Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, I quote some of the thought leaders talking about, and people are still thought leaders today, talking about, well, we should have radically reduced fossil fuel use in 1980 or even earlier. That's when I was born. And that would have just totally cut off so much progress, including 2+ billion people in China and India, dramatically improving their lives. So when we, understanding that cheap, plentiful, reliable energy is fundamental to human flourishing and that it's very difficult, and seeing that our thought leaders have a track record of ignoring those, underestimating the benefits of fossil fuels, and then overestimating the risks, that really made me afraid that, I basically knew that whatever they're proposing today has got to be way wrong and is really scary. It's much scarier than the temperature going up a few degrees, because they're talking about depriving us of this existential resource of cheap, plentiful, reliable energy from fossil fuels that is essential to life as we know it. There's no life as we know it without them, and there's nothing close that can produce the energy we need on the scale that we need. And then there's still billions of people who don't even have it at all. So with that, with that context, then hopefully you can see why when I hear somebody say, "Oh yeah, well, let's just reduce energy, no problem with that. Like as long as we go in some way in favor of solar or wind, as long as we do something against fossil fuels, we're safe." No, that's the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing. It would be like, there's not even an exact analogy to food, because it's possible to be overfed in a way that it's not possible to be over-energized. But you can just imagine a country where there's barely enough food, and then people are saying, well, like, I object to this kind of food and this kind of food and this kind of food, and so let's reduce our calories by 50%, and then we'll make it up through this other thing that's never been proven to work. Like, you'd be terrified. And so you should be terrified of these kinds of recommendations. And at the very least, when you're in a conversation about these things, when somebody's talking about the risks of continuing to use fossil fuels, ask them about the risks of not continuing to use fossil fuels.
Well, I want to underscore kind of a point that you brought up throughout that discussion, because I think it's so important. The issue of that these benefits from fossil fuels are demonstrated in action, right? Like, this is not somebody who came up with a study and says, hey, fossil fuels are going to reduce your energy costs. It's that we've had decades and decades and decades of them actually running a civilization, and that the assurances that we're supposed to have that we can ban it are all based on promises, not proof. And yet, like, if you read the media, it's just, oh, this latest study or this latest claim is treated as on the same level with actual demonstrated ability of fossil fuels. I've been doing a lot of research into electric vehicles, and it's just astonishing how much the kind of claims of people trying to sell their own electric vehicles are treated as proving the actual capabilities of these. As in reality, like, there's cases in a number of cities that have bought these electric buses and have found that their claimed ranges are far greater than their actual ranges. And, like, that's just for a city bus. If you're doing that with, your sources of electricity, then, well, I mean, you can end up in a situation, like, where you're experiencing the lack of energy or the lack of ability to afford energy. And so, like, just the bar for overturning something that has a proven track record and is vital to your life should be very, very high. And it's treated as, in effect, the complete opposite, where, the case for keeping fossil fuels has to be really, really high. But, if you can get somebody from a think tank that has, even the word renewables or green in its title to say that, no, this is doable and it's affordable, then all right, that's fine. Let's give the government the power to ban the energy that keeps us alive.
One more thought on that, which is that the one thing to note in terms of the risks of not using fossil fuels are that because fossil fuel use is fundamental to our civilization, we have so many of the resources in our civilization are based on the expectation that we'll continue to be able to use fossil fuels. So as consumers, we have, hopefully I'm not throwing them under the bus, but my sister and brother-in-law, they just bought a car, and guess what? It's a fossil fuel car, like a little SUV. And people are doing this all the time. I mean, of course, the EVs are also fossil fuel vehicles, but certainly the gasoline powered vehicles are. And so people are, and you think about how much of an investment a car is. People are spending a lot of resources on these. And then they're being told that, well, in some very near future, you will not be allowed to use these machines, or you should not be allowed to use these machines. So that's just consumer goods. But then if you think about what are called capital goods, so those are the goods that industry uses to produce other goods. You think about, okay, well, how many coal plants are there? How many gas plants are there? How many oil refineries are there? How many steel plants are there? And those are all based on different forms of fossil fuel technology for good reasons. And yet when people talk about these kinds of rapid transitions, that inevitably means that they're talking about destroying the value of a huge portion of the assets in our society. And so even if you had a replacement that was exactly as good as fossil fuels for all of these uses, there would still be a huge destruction. It would be like if we just said, oh, well, AC power, we use AC power now, but let's transition everything to DC power. And let's say you could do it for ultimately the same price, but it would be a massive price because you'd be destroying all of these assets. So the fact that the destruction of assets is not even acknowledged just shows how little people are thinking about the benefits that we get from fossil fuels, and how indifferent they are to losing those, even though that's a huge percentage of the assets that we have in our society. And then on top of that, what there, as you indicated, need to be enormous standards of proof before talking about replacing these things. And usually what you have in a market is that the standards of proof are that other people are using them in significant ways with a lot of success, and then you have reasons to believe that you can. So if let's say we had a free market and say nuclear power was taking off and somebody was using that with success, then more and more companies would start to invest in nuclear power, and that would be great. But it would proceed in a beneficial way with people buying new plants as it made sense, as they were proven, as their existing assets had depreciated in value. They wouldn't do these kinds of crash programs where they're destroying all of this existing asset value and then calling for it to be replaced with all of these extremely speculative things. And then on top of that, calling for the entity of replacement not to be the private judgment of companies, but to be Beto O'Rourke or the equivalent, right? It's basically the government. So you have the guaranteed destruction of asset destruction. You have the guaranteed destruction of mandating a woefully inefficient replacement, and then you have the guaranteed destruction of the government implementing it. So this is not at all about let's think carefully about what's good for human flourishing. This is about we've got an ideological, religious opposition to fossil fuels, this favoritism for renewables, or more broadly for this idea of an untouched planet. And consistent with that, we have an ideology that it is important for the government to pursue our goals by controlling more and more aspects of our lives. And then, of course, the individuals like O'Rourke have the convenient conviction that they personally are needed to wield this government control in a wise way. So they personally will often come across as insincere, and I think they are in a lot of ways. But the framework that we're operating in is one where we're encouraging dictators because we're saying that, yeah, we need to totally change our system. We need to change it in this green way, which obviously private people won't do, and thus we need a wise and powerful dictator to tell us what to do. And the idea is all of that is wrong. And if we look at what we actually need, what's actually led to the way of life that we have, which is the best way of life overall that anyone has ever had, is that we've had a lot of freedom and we've had a lot of fossil fuels. And so we want to keep that freedom, including the freedom to use fossil fuels. Okay, which one of you is next? I think, Stefan, your story is next.
That's right.
Go for it.
So in an attempt to make the Green New Deal concrete and local, the city government of New York City is trying to implement its own radical version. So a legislative package for this has passed the city council with 45-2 votes. And it contains something like banning skyscrapers and hot dogs. So the biggest emission source in New York City is buildings, because you need a lot of cooling for the skyscrapers and also a lot of heating in the winter. And so New York Mayor Bill de Blasio was on a TV interview, and he said, "We are going to ban the classic glass and steel skyscrapers, which are incredibly inefficient." And the timetable for this is, by the way, the year 2030. So just similar to the deadline of the Green New Deal in Congress. And also they want to source 100% of government energy, so that all the energy that the government uses in New York City within 5 years from only renewable power sources, or not power sources, but renewable sources. So I think that's expensive to impossible, but that's the plan. And then only 5 years. And in a different story, they're also banning processed meat. That's where the hot dog story comes from, in the city menu. So in hospitals and public places that are owned by the city, they would get the processed meat off the table, because that is supposedly very climate damaging because of the methane and CO2 emissions involved in that. So just to give an opposition voice to see whether there's a real fighting back in New York City on this, there's a real estate board of New York, and they are saying to this in their statement 3 years from now, when a new city council is seated, the press releases issued this week cheering the council's quote unquote bold action will be long forgotten and the hard truths will settle in. With so many exemptions and carve outs, we will be confronted with the fact that our city is off track from meeting its ambitious 40% carbon reduction goal by 2030. So the opposition to that, the strongest opposition to that, is not that, okay, this is a bad plan, or we don't think these climate goals are realistic, or whatever. They are saying this is not the right plan because there's too many exemptions, too many people get off the hook and don't have to implement it. And I also find this a conflicting message from the environmentalist perspective, because on one hand, we are told that, big mega cities where, as many people as possible should be crammed into the electric city buses and housing units, on a very, very low square foot measure of living space and so on. That's very efficient and therefore good for the planet. And at the same time, we now learn, oh, New York City is actually not really sustainable and not good for the planet in terms of this green ideal of, using as little resources as possible. So I find this a conflicting message. So it seems to be that you are already checkmate as soon as you breathe air and live as a human being. You need to be either super poor, primitive, Stone Age culture, or you are hurting the planet and being over the carrying capacity.
Yeah, I mean, just that there's a story that we're going to ban skyscrapers in New York.
Yeah.
That's a story, and that people are so eagerly embracing the most dictatorial interpretations possible of the idea of reducing CO2 emissions. Because I've thought a lot about, particularly in connection with the new Moral Case for Fossil Fuels book, which will be out at some point, but buy the original, moralcaseforfossilfuels.com, or get it at Amazon. That's still very relevant, and the new one won't be out for a little while. So I just lost my train of thought promoting. So I should have lost, or talking about, the dictatorial nature of these kinds of proposals. Because I've been thinking about, okay, what would you actually do to the extent that this is a problem? What you would do is you'd look for, okay, what are actually high leverage things that can be done? Things such as developing nuclear power, cost effective alternatives more broadly, relatively affordable ways of capturing CO2. That would be a huge one. Potentially geoengineering, getting better at different forms of climate mastery so that you're able to deal with more kinds of climate related issues as and when they come up. Those are the kinds of things you would want to focus on. But if you're focused on them from a human flourishing perspective, you're focused on reducing CO2 in the context of you want human beings to live long lives and to enjoy them. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to be restricting freedom left and right. You don't want to be depriving people of their preferences all the time. You want to figure out, okay, what are the actual big levers, and let's move toward that. But you notice that the way that it's actually conducted is just looking for totalitarian control, whether governmental or even just through these private little rituals like buying a certain car or sorting your trash a certain way. There's just this focus on how can we control every aspect of people's lives to be environmentally friendly or climate friendly. And so this is really just a torture session that people get put through, where they're, to the extent that they're trying to do anything good by the standard of reducing emissions, because they're just being told left and right, oh, do this, don't do that, don't do that. And then any freedom is at stake, because we're taught that, oh, well, everything's interconnected, and so you're not free. You can't be free because you emit CO2 emissions. And versus from a human flourishing perspective, you realize, okay, well, CO2 emissions, that's just one, at most, that's one part of the human flourishing equation. And so we would want to reduce that, but we would want to reduce that in a way that's consistent with people living and enjoying their lives and not micromanaging their lives in a way that's misery inducing and actually doesn't accomplish anything in terms of reducing CO2. So when I would just encourage people, you should be really rebellious when people act like they get to dictate your life because of this particular concern. Now, if they have this particular concern, they have to find a cost-effective way of dealing with it, and then maybe they could reasonably ask you to do that, but they cannot ask you to sacrifice your life in the name of these things that won't even reduce CO2 emissions. Don, what's your next story?
There's bills both in Pennsylvania and Ohio that are intended to prop up nuclear power plants that are facing economic troubles and could close down. And so there's a whole debate going on. Some people are worried that they're too expensive. Environmentalists are concerned that keeping nuclear open leads us in the wrong direction rather than the right direction, which is shutting them down, shutting fossil fuels down, and having solar and wind. And basically what's at stake here in the short term is that there's 4 nuclear plants that are slated for early retirement in these 2 states in the near future if they don't receive these bailout subsidies. And similar measures were already enacted in Illinois, New York, and New Jersey. And one of the interesting dynamics is precisely that it's the environmentalists who are opposed to these, and it's in Ohio's case, the Republican governor Mike DeWine, who's saying that, look, if we're going to have any chance of meeting our low and no carbon electricity goals, like nuclear provides 90% of our zero carbon electricity, and so there's no way that we're going to come close if we don't save nuclear. And I mean, as a rule, I'm opposed to subsidies, but to the extent I could be sympathetic, I'm sympathetic to the extent that the whole context here is that you've had an industry that's basically been destroyed by regulation, both anti-nuclear regulation, but in particular, wind and solar favoritism that, for various reasons, is particularly hits hard, reliable baseload power that cannot adjust to the ups and downs of intermittent energy. And so, I mean, at a minimum, I'd be willing to at least entertain an argument that said, well, we're going to temporarily keep these nuclear plants alive, because once you shut them down, I mean, that's the end of it. But it has to come with regulatory reforms that stop artificially punishing nuclear. I'm curious what your evaluation is, Alex.
Yeah, I have similar thoughts. Stefan, didn't you do some work on this recently? Did you do an interview on this morning? I know we had talked about that.
An interview? No.
Oh, I thought we had talked about, no, well, that's kind of internal stuff anyway, but I thought that there was some radio interview that you might have done, but you wrote out some answers on this recently, right?
Yeah, so one interesting part of this bailout business for both nuclear and coal power plants is that the necessity, or the apparent necessity from a policy standpoint, stems from the fact that solar and wind as intermittent renewable power sources have received so much favorable treatment. And so when they enter the power grid and are given priority, they are essentially sort of destroying the business model of baseload power plants, which are mostly coal and nuclear. And so they are built to essentially, produce a constant level of power at a very high and efficient level, and then they can produce very cheap electricity. But when intermittent renewables enter the power grid, and they are introducing some volatility in the generation of electric power, then nuclear power plants and coal power plants can't just do that, what they are built for, and they have to adapt to that. And one of the problems is then that they are running at an inefficient level, or that, for example, maybe at noon, when they would have prime time to make money with cheap baseload power, they are not able to do that and not recover the capital expenses. And then, of course, the renewable advocates will say, hey, look, they are being beaten by renewable power sources on the free market. But it's not a free market, right? So they have been built to fill a certain role, and that is now sort of getting destroyed by the intermittent energy sources. and the intermittent energy sources never have to produce reliable energy. When the sun goes down and solar doesn't produce anything, it's never punished for that. It's not punished for not producing reliable energy. But the baseload power plants, like nuclear power plants, are being punished for not being able to do what they haven't been designed to do, and which is only necessary because solar and wind enter the power grid. So that's a very, very sort of unfair, rigged market from regulation to start with, and then you can't argue, oh, this is a market outcome. It's not.
Yeah, I think I'm just so we've got this phenomenon of the government in various forms runs a lot of the electrical system, and I'm just generally very worried about anything that's compromising the reliability of that system, particularly just because there's this obsession with these using these unreliable fuels. And then those are also totally screwing up the prices that people are paying. So yeah, I wouldn't use the kind of when you're dealing with proven forms of power that we know can produce power very cheaply. Uh, I'm sympathetic to things that are keeping them open, and I think the key is to move toward policies where you you have proper policies toward the unreliable fuels where they have to meet certain standards of reliability. Otherwise, they are severely penalized or not allowed on. Because just in terms of just the basic logic, it just doesn't make any sense that, oh, nuclear power plants are suddenly becoming really expensive, given that those are plants where there's a lot of upfront investment, but then it's very, very low fuel cost over time. So to shut those down, there's probably something off in the way that you are running your grid. Okay, Stefan, do you have a quick final story today?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. So California politicians are blaming the industry, the oil and gas industry, or rather the oil and refining industry, uh, uh, for high gasoline prices in the state of California, and they're alleging a conspiracy behind the price hike. So California Governor Gavin Newsom uh, is demanding an investigation of the state's currently high gasoline prices, which is around $4 per gallon of regular gasoline compared to $2.5 per gallon in places like Alabama and Louisiana. And Newsom alleges an quote unquote inappropriate industry practices case here for quote unquote unaccounted for price differentials. So he compares, what is the average California paying and what is the average Alabama citizen paying for gasoline. And then we have higher taxes and so on and certain infrastructure. And then there's a price differential that we can't explain. That's what a study found for the price differences among states. But there's a couple of things that can explain that. So first of all, some refining capacity recently in California has experienced shutdowns from various problems, which of course can happen. But this time it's several refineries at once, which of course uh, makes a supply bottleneck for the gasoline fuel. And there's also a trend of declining domestic oil production in the state of California, which has chosen, for political reasons, to not opt into the shale gas and oil revolution. And there's also California is notorious for its red tape and regulations, in particular against fossil fuels. So they are making it difficult for oil developers, oil refiners, oil transporters, and so on. And they are burying them in red tape and creating these costly regulations. And then they argue, okay, so where are our smaller competition producers? Why are they not entering the market? Why is there a price differential, right? So it makes no sense. You can't just make it very expensive for smaller refiners or smaller retailers to enter the market or to operate in the market, and then blame high price levels for gasoline on the industry. There's no conspiracy. It's policy. It's decades long policy by Californians. But of course, the politicians need some scapegoat. So I'm personally surprised that the prices in California are as low as they are. If I would invest in California's fossil fuel industry, I would demand a really big additional margin on my profit margin, because of the high risk. Because I don't know whether Governor Newsom and some of the state assembly or the senate will be destroying my capital 5 years down the road.
Yeah, we should do a little bit more research into some of the specifics, just 'cause I think that there's a real opportunity to connect with American drivers, and particularly California drivers, and talk to them about how much they're getting screwed by these policies. And they're being asked to make these sacrifices that accomplish nothing except increasing the status of other people. So yeah, and I get asked this sometimes I ride a lot of Uber, and I get asked this by different Uber drivers. Now, according to Elon Musk, and I really hope he's right, next year he's going to have a fleet of robo taxis. That's all. That would be an interesting power hour discussion topic, is just to talk about that, because I'm I'm gonna ramble about this for a second. I'm super interested. I've become probably too interested in the Tesla investor story, and I got interested in this about a year ago because Musk is such a fascinating hybrid, no pun intended, of different qualities. And one thing is he's just clearly has this engineering brilliance, and he's got a really I like a lot of his methods of thinking, but then he's totally got this whole philosophy of sustainability, and in particular, we should be using solar, and he doesn't in any way meaningful support nuclear, and he has this dogma that, okay, well, we need to use batteries for everything. And so what's been interesting is that when I've just been following the debate over what's going to happen with the company, the thing that I should have said this publicly before. I might have written it down privately, but my concern about it was going to be that a lot of people are buying Teslas for different kinds of status reasons. What happens when that cachet diminishes? It'll diminish for some reason, and then of course there was the chance of the tax credit expiring. But just in general, people buy cars, they have a lot of reasons involved. One thing that was interesting about the case for Tesla was that people were acting like, oh, Tesla is just by far the best car based on the merits. And like, even if it is the absolute best car, like if the Model S is the absolute best car, for people who have a certain amount of money, which I don't even think that's true in many cases, but it's definitely not the best car for most people. And so what it's interesting that there's a sort of Kool-Aid drinking where people are acting like, oh, well, objectively, of course, Tesla's the best car, and part of being the best car is having a battery in you. And no, for most people, it's not the best car at all. And even a lot of people bought it, and it wasn't actually the best car for them. They spent a lot more money than they'd intended, maybe, but there was a certain coolness buying a Tesla. But now, you watch the Avengers movie and you see an e-tron, or if you have that kind of electric prestige, you see that, or maybe even that prestige is lost. And then you're dealing with the fact that these battery cars are still much more expensive than gasoline cars. So it's been interesting in the last quarter to see, oh, Tesla's demand fell off. There was this idea, well, demand would increase exponentially. And so it seems like there's been in part this collapse of demand, partially maybe because the status has somewhat worn off. That's probably a lot of it, because they've been decreasing the prices quite a bit, which of course kills their margins. But at the same time, what's exciting about Tesla is, so the battery stuff doesn't excite me very much, although that could be cool if it gets to the right price. But what's really exciting is automation, because listeners might know I don't even drive anymore. I just ride Uber. And if you could have automation, that would ultimately mean safer vehicles. And it would certainly be much, much cheaper if you didn't have to pay a human to drive it. Plus, they'd be totally quiet and no chit chat or anything like that. So I could really get a lot of work done. So the fact that Musk is talking about robo taxis next year, and he claims to have this huge advantage in AI, he has this tendency toward overstatement, but at the same time, he's got a lot of engineering knowledge. So I really hope that he's right there. And then, if he can do that, and then they should really hire us to help them with the regulatory stuff and the messaging around that. That would be really fun to help them do something really good, not this kind of sustainable mumbo jumbo, but the actual benefit of liberating human beings from any driving they don't want to do, and then liberating all kinds of productive and enjoyment abilities. So if anyone has any fascinating insights about to what extent the robo-taxi thing can happen soon, let us know. Okay, that is it for today. If you have any questions, comments, love mail, or hate mail, email our point person, whom I've appointed as Don. So Don Watkins is don@industrialprogress.net. Also, if you have any interest in a speech by me or Don or anyone else on our team, we've got a growing lineup of great speakers at all different price points. Email don@industrialprogress.net. And if you are interested in help with messaging, if you have an organization that has a lot of high stakes messaging projects and you'd like to possibly be a client of ours later this year when we free up, let Don know as well. Let's see. Anything else? Subscribe to the newsletter at alexepsteinlist.com. That's alexepsteinlist.com. And if you subscribe soon, then you'll get our weekly newsletter, and then you'll also get our Energy Clarity email course, which a lot of people like a lot. Okay. Hope everyone enjoyed this episode. We'll be back next week with some more great topics. Until then, I'm Alex Epstein. This has been Power Hour.
Power Hour. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of energy. Power Hour. The antidote to shallow thinking about energy issues.